Hey there! If you're new to ASP.NET Core web development, I'm sure that you heard a lot of times about ASP.NET Core API with Angular frontend. And maybe you are familiar with Angular already and you are familiar with ASP.NET Core, but how can we really set such a project up and how can we deploy it so that we can really see a result? Stay tuned because in this video we'll talk exactly about setting up an ASP.NET Core Web API with an Angular frontend. Welcome to Developer Ramp Up, a channel dedicated to anybody who wishes to become a software developer or a better software developer. In this video we'll talk about setting up and deploying a solution where we will have in the end an ASP.NET Core API and an Angular frontend. The things that we do here are fairly similar even if you want to have a React frontend, but for this video we'll concentrate on Angular. And the reason why I decided to do such a video is because when I started to develop in ASP.NET Core and when I started to develop my first very simple and basic APIs, I also wanted to have a frontend for them. So I started to study a little bit of Angular and I got fairly familiar with Angular, and I always saw like if I have two total different things, the ASP.NET Core API and the Angular frontend. And on my local machine, I was developing them separately, let's say, and I was able to make them communicating via HTTP calls and everything went fine. Because I was running like ng-serve with open, and then I would open the front end, and the front end, so the Angular app would then basically make all the needed calls to the API and so on. But I really struggled to find a way how to really set a project in such a way that we can easily deploy it to Azure or to any IIS server or to any Linux server and so on. So this is why I think that it's important to understand how this is supposed to work, and of course there are several scenarios. We will concentrate only on the most simple one, but we'll also talk a little bit about how we can do this also in a more complicated way. So let's get started by creating a new Visual Studio solution. And I will click on File, New Project, and here there is one important thing I always like to do. For this type of projects where I want to have a backend like ASP.NET Core API and separately a frontend and maybe or probably also other application layers, what I really like to do is to always start with a blank solution. And the way to create a blank solution in Visual Studio is simply going on other project types, where of course you can find also Visual Studio solution and you find this blank solution. So I will choose this blank solution and let's name it Angular API, which is fairly strange because Angular is you cannot create an Angular API, but it's the concept of our demo here because we want to combine this ASP.NET Core API and the Angular frontend. So just click on OK and the new solution will be created. As said, this is a blank solution, so you really don't have anything here. As a next step, we can really start creating our project. So right click and add new project. Here we have several options, but I would like to start with my ASP.NET Core API. So what I will do here is simply find here in this list web development, which is here, and I have here ASP.NET Core application running on ASP.NET Core, of course. So let's click OK. We can also give a title here like Ang API. Then click OK. Normally now I should be presented with a new dialog from where I can choose a project template. And you can see here that there are a lot of project templates already there for you in Visual Studio. And we can see that we also have an Angular project template. The reason why I really don't like to use this Angular project template is because in this case Angular is really tied to a totally separate ASP.NET Core application. And I prefer to have my Angular really running independently of anything else. Sure, we will have to make some configurations in our API so that we can serve the Angular files, and we will come back to that a little bit later. But once again, I really don't like to use this Angular project template. However, right now I wanted to create the API, so let's create the API. We can also use this configure for HTTPS, which is a new default feature in ASP.NET Core 2.1. And now our project will be created. Okay, so now we have our new project. We can simply also close this window. And what we can do here is maybe wait just a little bit for all packages and all dependencies to be resolved. In the meantime, if we take a look here, this is the really basic and standard values API that you would get with this API project template. If we click on this controller, we'll see that we have really very simple action results. Everything is in memory. On a get, we simply return a value 1 and value 2 and so on. We can also post and get a value by ID. However, you notice here that we have a lot of red squiggly lines. This is because the dependencies aren't still completely resolved. We can help this by right-clicking the project and clicking on build. So this will hopefully make the dependency resolution a little bit more faster. Now everything seems to work fine. All dependencies are resolved, so we don't have any red squiggly lines anymore. And right now I don't want to concentrate about this ASP.NET Core API project. Of course, we have this startup.cs where we configure our services and our middleware, and we will come to this a little bit later. But right now I would like to set up this solution further. So what I would need to do is to add a new project. This time I would like to add a project that would hold our Angular application. So we have add new project. Normally what I do here is I also choose ASP.NET Core web application, but I will name this Angular. Click OK. And now when I have this window, I usually choose empty and of course OK. Now when we have this new project, we have the exact same problems that we had also earlier. Dependencies are still not resolved. And we see also that we have this startup.cs and program.cs and www-root and so on. We won't need these classes and we won't need the www-root folder. So what I would do and what I usually do is simply delete them, because we really don't need them anymore. This will hold only our Angular project. Now, of course, you can also go into the dependencies and remove this dependency from here, because we don't need a dependency to ASP.NET Core. In this project, we will not run ASP.NET Core at all. We simply want to install an Angular application here. This is also precisely the next step that we will do. I will assume that you are already a little bit familiar with Angular CLI, and how you create a new Angular application using the Angular CLI. So let's switch over to the Angular CLI or to the node command prompt, and let's try to create a new Angular application. So here we are. This is my node command prompt where I already have installed, of course, Angular CLI and so on. So everything should be ready to proceed. Of course, what I would like to do is to install the application, the Angular application, or to create the Angular application in the folder that corresponds to the solution or to the project that I have already added. So I would need to switch directories to source repos. You basically would have to change the directory to the directory where you have created your solution and project. And here I mistyped something, so let's change the directory once again. So it would be source repos, and I don't remember exactly where I have saved this, but this should be API Angular. And here I have my Angular API. So I would have to switch directory again, and this would be Angular API. This is correct. Now let's check exactly what folders do we have here, and we see that we have the Angular API folder and we have the Angular folder, and we want to install or to create a new Angular application in this Angular folder because this is the folder that corresponds to the project that we have added for Angular. So once again we switch directories and we will go to Angular. And of course, if we click here on dir, we will see different things that were added with our project, but these things really don't bother us right now. What we will do next is simply create a new application. So this would be ng-new, the standard command line or Angular CLI command to create a new Angular application. And then we have to provide, of course, our application name, and let's name it DevRamp from Developer Ramp Up, our YouTube channel, and click on enter. Now it would take a little bit for this process to complete, but right now the Angular CLI will simply install a new Angular application in the specified folder. And you see that there will be a lot of packages that would be extracted, there will be a lot of packages that will be installed, and so on. So we have to wait a little bit until everything is done, and then we can of course continue. When the installation completes, we'll see something similar to this. And purely theoretically, now we should have the new Angular application. If we look once again in our directory structure here, we see that we have also a new folder which is called DevRamp. This is exactly the name that we gave to the application. So let's switch to this folder. In this folder, we should have some very specific Angular files like the CLI.json and so on. Theoretically, right now what we could do is ng-serve.open, and this should start the application and of course open a web browser. However, I got this error. This is due to my Angular version. I have an older Angular version which is 5.6, and right now we already have Angular 6.1, and in 5.6 there was a problem with this missing node module, but what we can do is simply npm install and install this new module that we would need, and afterwards we should be able to run the application. Now we will also have to wait a little bit until everything is installed, but then we can come back and try to run our application once again. So once again, ng-serve with the option to open. I want to also open a web browser and to see the application. Now we should wait a little bit because what the CLI will try to do right now is to build the application so that it can serve the file afterwards. And then I should be able to see everything opening up in the browser. And that's it, our brand new Angular application. A very cool application, though even very simple right now, because this is the standard application that you get when you create a new application using the Angular CLI. Now we could of course start to build our front end, to add new components, to make our application look much more fancier and so on, but in this video we won't concentrate on this because this is not an Angular tutorial. Instead, what I would like to do is go back to Visual Studio, because right now we have to configure a few other things to make our application run also in Visual Studio. And if we go here, we already see that we have a new folder which is called DevRamp. Now you have to be sure to click this button first, because normally by default it is not on. So if you click it, then you would be able to really see all folders. And it also could happen that this folder was not added correctly to the solution. Well, in that case, you can simply right click this folder, and then you would have an option add to solution, and that would make your folder available for the solution. Right now this folder is already available for the solution, and we can see here, for instance, the Angular CLI.json, which is a very important part of our Angular application. Right now we have to configure some few more things. Let's for now remain with the Angular application. If we look in this Angular CLI JSON file, we see here a bunch of things that are important for the configuration of the Angular application. So these settings make sure that our application is able to run correctly depending on the environment that we are in. These settings also make it possible to unit test Angular applications and so on. But right now I would like to concentrate on a very important setting for our scenario, and this is this out there. What does this mean? Normally, when you build an Angular application, so with ng build, what happens is that, of course, the Angular CLI will build this application in a way that you can simply then upload via FTP to your web server and it should work. And by default, these packages or artifacts are located in a dist folder that will be created when we first run this ng build. Very important for our scenario is because we want to serve also the Angular application from our Angular API. So this means that we want to have both a front end, but also the API served from the exactly same web server. And this is possible. The only thing that we have to do is to make sure that we can get the build artifacts from Angular CLI to be located in the www root folder of our API. In this case, this is exactly what will we do. So we would have to navigate to that specific folder, and if you watch the folder structure, you would see that our folder containing the Ang API project is 2 levels up. So this is why we use this .. And now we would have to see exactly how the folder is called. And for this one, let's also open this Ang API project in File Explorer. So here should be an option to open in File Explorer. And here we can check the exact path because it's in source repos and then it's in Angular API and Ang API. So let's try to do this here. Let's first, however, look at something else. If we go back here in this repos and we see that we have this Angular API. So this is the folder that contains both our Angular project, which is the front-end project, and our API project, the ASP.NET Core project. Right now our Angular application is located here. So that's why we have to go 2 levels back. 1 level, 2 level. 2 levels, and this means that we are right now in the Angular API. So what we would have to do here is then say Ang API, where we have our W root folder, so Ang API, and hopefully I've written this correctly, and then www root, and that should do it. Let's test this out by running an ng build. Right now we have to stop the web server here, of course, because we don't need it anymore. Okay, then on yes, and our web server is stopped right now. And let's run ng build. This will take once again some seconds depending on how fast this goes, but since this project was already built one time, this should be now very fast. And in fact, we're already at 92% and we can see that everything completed correctly. So let's go to this www root folder and we can see here a bunch of Angular files, which is very cool because right now this means that we have a way to serve these files from our API project. Good. Let's for now close this Angular project, because we really don't need it anymore. The next steps that we have to do in order to make sure that we can set up Angular to be served from this www root is to add here some configuration in the middleware. Because if you remember, we did some videos about middleware. This concept of middleware in ASP.NET Core is very important because this is the way through which we could, let's say, dive into the request pipeline and make some changes or add some logic ourselves. For the purpose of this demo, so that it would not be too crowded, let's simply remove the HTTPS settings and let's add some things here. So first, what we need to add is app use static files. Static files middleware enables us or tells our ASP.NET Core project that in our project we also use some static files. These are the Angular files. So we instruct the application to know that we will have some static files that will be served from this project. Another middleware that we need is the default files middleware. So to use it, just simply app.use default files, and that should do it for now. Right now, what we have accomplished so far is that we tell our application, our ASP.NET Core application, that we will have some default files and that we also want to serve static files from the www root folder. There is, however, one thing that we still need to add here. And this is a custom middleware, a very simple custom middleware that makes sure in cases where the ASP.NET Core application is not able to find any route, that it redirects or it serves the index.html file and let then Angular do the routing on the front end. To do this, I will use a code snippet. Code snippets are very fancy. If you are familiar with them, they are very, very important because it makes a lot of things much easier. We have here to import also another web space, which is system.io. And what does this middleware? Let's dive into it. So of course, this is not a final middleware. What we do here is await next. We call the next delegate. So this means that when a request comes in from above, let's say, it will hit this app use middleware first, so our custom middleware, and it will then pass to the next middleware in the pipeline. But we'll also await the next, so this means that we want to await until we have a response. So in that case, we go into this if statement, and if the context and the response status code coming from ASP.NET Core is 404, which means it is a file not found, and if there is a path that has a certain value or has a value, so it is not null, it's not simple a host name. So this means that a request came in for a route that ASP.NET Core was not able to resolve. In that case, what we will do is we will add the path to the host name. This would make sure that when we serve or when the browser gets this response, it will get this index.html file, which is of course managed by Angular. So as soon as this happens, Angular will be hopefully able to resolve that needed route, and if not, of course, we can throw there an exception or show a page with 404 not found. And then of course we also use await.next to make sure that we pass this response now in this case to the next middleware, which would be this one. And right now theoretically we should be able to run this project, and when we debug we would expect that we would be able to access the Angular application. So let's try this out. It's once again the first time I am debugging this project, so it would probably take a little bit of time until it loads. But when this happens, what I would expect is, of course, we didn't configure anything yet, but I would expect that a browser window would open and normally to see the values from the API controller, so value 1 and value 2. Because if you are familiar, when you use this template, what it happens is that it is configured by default when you access this application, or when you debug this application, that it should go to API values. However, we will show you exactly how we can revert this setting so that when we debug the application, it goes directly to the hostname, so not trying to get any values from the API. We still need to wait a little bit until everything is loaded, but afterwards I would expect to see here just some simple strings like value1 and value2, which is the default normally in this controller values controller that comes by default with this ASP.NET Core Web API project. And in fact, that's true. We see here value1 and value2. However, the important thing is if we remove this path, that our ASP.NET Core application, of course, is able to resolve because we have a controller. But if we do that, we get the Angular application. So what we did by running ng-build, we already provisioned this Angular artifacts into the www root folder of this API. So when we debug this API, when we run this project, what we get on the default hostname is basically our Angular application. So let's close this down for now and go back here. If you want to configure your project to go directly to the host name, we can simply go to properties, and under debugging, we should have under debug the option here. You see that we have this here. So what we will need instead is, let's simply add this host name there, and this should do the trick for us. So okay, let's save and let's debug once again. Right now I would expect that directly our Angular application will pop up, and it should be a lot faster than previously because we already built it once. It knows exactly where all files are and so on. And as you can see here already, we are not redirected to our API, but we get the Angular application instead. So this is cool. This is one checkpoint that we wanted to achieve. We have deployed basically our Angular application into an ASP.NET Core project, and when we debug this project, we see our Angular application. Now, of course, there is one last thing that we have to take into consideration. Let's say that we want to deploy this application somewhere so that it would be publicly available. In my case, what I would like to do is deploy it to an Azure App Service. So let's look a little bit into how we could do that. This is my Azure portal where I already created a web app where I want to deploy this demo. It's a very simple web app, and here are a lot of settings and information about this web app. It is, however, out of scope of this video to dive deeper into how web apps work. For now, it's just important to know that we have this web app in Azure. Now, if we switch back to Visual Studio, what we'll do right now, I have to say that if you have an Azure subscription and if you are logged in to Visual Studio with an account that also has an Azure subscription, or if you add an additional account to Visual Studio that has an Azure subscription, deploying this application to Azure is really very simple. Also, in order to this to work, when you install Visual Studio, it's good to install also all the Azure features and dependencies that you can choose when you choose what exactly do you want to install with Visual Studio. And if everything is all right, we can simply right click our API project, and then of course we can click on publish. What this will do, it will build a publishing profile. So it will publish this application, all the needed artifacts and so on. And here I see this window where I say that, okay, I want to deploy it to an app service, and I want to deploy it to an existing app service. And then when I click on publish, you see that this is also my account on which I'm running an Azure subscription. So I will choose the subscription, and then I can already see the resource group, and here I can see my application that is ready for this demo to run. So just click on OK here, and this will publish the application, and of course it will build it. And in few seconds, depending on how fast this goes, because it's the first time that this application gets published, it could take a while. But what it would happen afterwards, it will simply push all these artifacts together with everything that we have here in www root to the Azure App Services that I have specified. And as we know, we already know that we are able to run this application and to also run our Angular application when we debug this project. So I would expect that when we deploy it to Azure, we would be able to have the same outcome. This means that when the publishing is over, normally a new browser window will open, and what we would see, it should be the standard Angular application that we also saw earlier when we debugged that locally. However, in this case, as you can see, everything is running in this Azure App Service, and that's it. It works. Right now we have a very cool, though very simple Angular application as front end with a back end, with an ASP.NET Core backend. And in fact, if we go on API values, we should be able to see our values, value 1 and value 2. So we have everything up and running. Everything is configured locally for debugging, and we also have published our application to Azure. So that's mostly it for this video. However, before we really wrap this up, there are some things that I want to say. First of all, this is not the only way in which you can configure an Angular application to run alongside your ASP.NET Core Web API. There are several ways, and a lot of developers would say that there are a lot of better ways, but in my opinion this is also a matter of preference. The main drawback to this approach that I have used here is that you would have, when you want to test this locally, what you would need to do is to separately start your ASP.NET Core API to debug it, and you would have then to separately start with ng-serve the front end for it if you want to test the front end. And well, this might seem like a little bit of overhead, but as said, my personal preference is that I keep these two different applications, these two projects really separated. Because for instance, there are some times when I want to work with Visual Studio Code, and when I just want to test my front end, and I really don't want to debug the entire Visual Studio solution when I'm running different tests. So this is the main drawback, that you cannot simply run both backend and frontend from the same place. There are some static file middleware for SPAs, so for single page applications, that you can use and configure everything in such a way that when you click F5 on, or when you debug the ASP.NET Core project, what it would happen in the background is that some npm scripts or Angular CLI scripts will be ran, and also your front end will be built then at the same time. However, as said, I prefer to have everything separated, and this is why I also made this video on this specific approach. However, an advantage of this approach, in my opinion, is that this is really easy to configure and get started with. And there are a lot of circumstances or scenarios with, let's say, smaller, not that complex applications that you might even build for production that you could configure and deploy this way. You could even, let's say, put this on VSTS, Visual Studio Team Services, or Jenkins, or in any other CI/CD pipeline, and you can build the final artifact based exactly on the same structure. And in fact, I did this with some applications in production where I used exactly this approach. When you have a lot more complex applications or more complex scenarios or environments that you would have to handle, it might be useful to use a different approach. A totally different approach to Angular and ASP.NET Core backend is to deploy this separately. So we could choose, for instance, to run our Angular application in one Azure web app and the ASP.NET Core Web API in a totally different web app. The main advantage here is that you could scale then these applications individually. So this means if you have more load on your front end, you can scale your front end up and out. If you have less load on the ASP.NET Core API, then you can scale also independently the ASP.NET Core API and so on. In that case, the way to proceed is simply take the Angular artifacts and upload them via FTP to the web server where you want to host your Angular application or Azure web app, and then of course then publish with the .NET CLI this ASP.NET Core API, take then the files and of course then upload them via FTP to the other web server or to the other Azure web app that you might want to use. So that's mostly it. I think after this video we should all be able to set up a project or a solution where we run an ASP.NET Core API and an Angular frontend, and serving of course all the static files, all the Angular files from our www root from our ASP.NET Core API. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't be shy and hit the thumbs up and the subscribe button to the channel. Also, if you think that there are some more things that you want to have discussed on Developer Ramp Up, make sure you drop a comment and let me know about your thoughts, and maybe you have some questions. Also, you can drop a comment, and if you really feel that this content might be useful also for other colleagues or peers from your networks and so on, don't be once again shy and share this video on your social networks. Thank you once again very much for watching, and until the next time I wish you the very best.